These are recorders. All right. Begging your indulgence, I open with a prayer. Gathering here today, we acknowledge the traditional custodianship of this land by the Australian people of the British nation, and pay our respects to their monarchs past, present, and emerging. Thank you. With no disrespect, thank you. I only have 25 minutes. With no disrespect to Aboriginal Australians, Christians, or indeed anyone who prays, the earnest Australian custom of the acknowledgement of country is, of course, a postmodern prayer, with always was, always will be, serving as its postmodern amen. As a public prayer, it is not meant to be answered. It is meant to be heard. It is what the Spectator columnist James Bartholomew called a virtue signal. People who really want to pay respect to Aboriginal elders, past, present, and emerging, can take the time to attend community events, volunteer, or better yet, travel to majority Indigenous areas for their vacations, instead of jetting off to Port Douglas, Byron Bay, or Bali. People who really believe that the homes from which they are zooming always were and always will be Aboriginal land should do the right thing and give them up. But people who want to be seen to be good, say the acknowledgement of country. And the more elaborate, the better. If you want to hear truly ostentatious acknowledgements of country, just come to the University of Sydney. But for most people, the basic model will do. That includes people who may not even be clear just whose country they are acknowledging. Go out to the suburbs, and you now hear the acknowledgement of country at the meetings of Chinese, Indian, and Maltese community associations. Many of the acknowledgers reading off their cue cards obviously have no idea what the acknowledgement means. They're like children reciting the Lord's Prayer. Find me an 8-year-old who knows what hallowed be thy name means, and I'll show you 2 parents who deserve a medal. For these well-meaning community leaders, the acknowledgement of country signals that they're good Australians, like eating barbecue or saying good on ya. It's what Australians do. It is even more than a virtue signal. It is a citizenship card. In polite society, and sadly under this designation, I must admit that I cannot include many members of the Samuel Griffith Society. The acknowledgement of country is a signal. The acknowledgement of country is a signal that the acknowledger is among the few, the elect, the saved. Never mind that everyone in polite society says it. Everyone wants to be seen to be among the elect, whether or not Z really is. I note Z is the non-binary third-person singular pronoun. And so it was in the days of John Calvin, the Dutch burghers, America's Pilgrim Fathers, Oliver Cromwell's Puritan Commonwealth. Calvinism may have been less fiery over the last 400 years, and it certainly has become more secular, but it has never gone away. Its spiritual home is still Harvard University, founded in 1636 as the English-speaking world's first Puritan university. The presbyters of the new Calvinism are still drawn from the same self-perpetuating academic aristocracy. Its political party is still England's dissenter-dominated Liberal Party, latterly the Liberal Democrats. In Australia, it's the Greens. We all know the signs of the elect. In present-day Australia, they are acknowledgement of country, support for LGBTQIA+ rights, and climate catastrophism. Other causes struggle to make the list, as the numerology of pre-literate societies seems to indicate the untrained mind can only count to 3. For a while, COVID catastrophism displaced climate catastrophism, and I have a colleague who for 2 years listed climate change as a health threat on the mandatory workplace health and safety check we are required to consider at the first agenda item of every staff meeting in a desperate attempt to keep climate change in the big three. Now that the coronavirus crisis has passed, Free Fridays, or what are officially called Fridays for the Future, have returned. Not that it's impossible to break into the big three. Acknowledgement of country, or in the US and UK, Black Lives Matter, is a relative newcomer to the list. Sadly, it knocked off the starving children in Africa. Of course, acknowledgement of country has a big advantage. It's much cheaper than solving global hunger. The starving children always wanted you to give money. Hey. Does anyone remember how before everyone loved gay people, everyone loved refugees? Just try getting a quorum for Refugee Week these days. For your information, the 2022 dates are June 19th to 25th. Gay Mardi Gras was never so popular. The Calvinist urge to virtue-signaling membership in the elect can make life nigh unlivable for the independent thinker. In our times, from the highest class of society down to the lowest, everyone lives as under the eye of a hostile and dreaded censorship, not only in what concerns others, but in what concerns only themselves. People do not ask themselves, what do I prefer, or what would suit my character and disposition, or what would allow the best and highest in me to have fair play and enable it to grow and thrive. They ask themselves, what is suitable for my position? What is usually done by persons of my station and pecuniary circumstances? Or, worse still, what is usually done by persons of a station and circumstances superior to mine? That was John Stuart Mill, writing in 1859, at the height of a previous wave of Calvinist revival, the Great Awakening. Our present-day Great Awakening has nothing on that era except perhaps an even greater speed of communication. Their big three causes were abolition, women's suffrage, and temperance. And they did it pretty well, 2 out of 3. Like statue tumblers today, the social Calvinists of the Great Awakening pursued their causes with a religious fervor. And like statue tumblers today, they wanted someone else to foot the bill. The abolitionists wanted slave owners to bear the costs of unraveling the slave economy. In the UK, they failed. In the US, they succeeded. The suffragists wanted women to get the vote while men went out to war. And it might be remembered that from ancient times, the prerogative of voting was tied to bearing mortal responsibility for the actions voted. The prohibitionists wanted an instantaneous end to alcohol without providing for the people whose businesses and jobs would be lost. It was perhaps the failure to plan any transition of that kind that doomed America's 14-year experiment with temperance. Abolition, suffrage, temperaments, acknowledgement of country, LGBTQIA+ rights, climate catastrophism. Obviously, these are not to be found in the theology of John Calvin. They are our society's virtue signals, our society's indications of membership in the elect. They are the tenets of the new liberal religion. Liberalism is a broad church all across the English-speaking world. There are classical liberals, progressive liberals, internationalist liberals, welfare liberals, even conservative and neoconservative liberals, to say nothing of neoliberals. There are even libertarian liberals and populist liberals. What makes us all liberal, to quote the Oxford English Dictionary, is our support for or advocacy of individual rights, civil liberties, and reform, tending towards individual freedom, democracy, or social equality. We all embrace those ideals, or at least most of us do, and we all believe in them with a quasi-religious faith. It may sound disingenuous to lump the members of the Samuel Jackson Society in with the organizers of the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, but honestly, our most acute differences are over means not ends. How many people in this room want Aboriginal Australians to experience another century of intergenerational poverty? Don't raise your hands. How many would refuse the friendship of homosexual neighbors? How many want to destroy the earth in pursuit of their own advantage? There are plenty of people in other countries who would answer the other way on these and similar questions. Our society is thoroughly liberal in contrast to others and is much the better for it. But although our liberal society may be inclusive and simpatico, its elite liberal religion decidedly is not. The neo-Calvinism of the English-speaking world's intellectual elite is the exclusive religion of a wrathful secular God. Yet a religion it is, and a sociologically Calvinist one at that. Which is not to say that it has anything to do with the actual theology of John Calvin. Theologists may not like it, but every society adapts religion to its own purposes, to its own goals. If you're a Christian, are you a homoousian, a homoiousian, or a homoian? In the 4th century, your answer could have been a matter of life and death. Today, you are probably homoousian, but unless you're extraordinarily theologically inclined, you probably don't care. Anyway, your church almost certainly won't kick anyone out for disagreeing. It needs all the members it can get. But many Christian churches today will kick people out for disparagement of Aboriginal Australians, for disparagement of homosexuals, or even, in some extreme cases, churches will kick people out for climate denial. If they wouldn't expel members outright, they would certainly make the unvirtuous feel unwelcome. Proselytizing among the prostitutes and publicans is one thing. Proselytizing among the impolite is something else entirely. As St. Paul advises, be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what common hath light with darkness? There you go. The postmodern Calvinist's prescription for the non-compliant individualist is stigmatization, social exclusion, damnation. John Stuart Mill explicitly identified the political correctness of his time with a latter-day Calvinism. He warned that society has now fairly got the better of individuality, and the danger which threatens human nature is not the excess, but the deficiency of personal impulses and preferences. He followed this with the quote cited above, tracing the repression of individuality to the fact that everyone lives as under the eye of a hostile and dreaded censorship. He then asked, now is this, or is it not, the desirable condition of human nature? His answer, it is so on the Calvinist theory. According to that, the one great offense of man is self-will. All the good of which humanity is capable is comprised in obedience. You have no choice, thus you must do, and no otherwise. Whatever is not a duty is a sin. That is the theory of Calvinism, and it is held in a mitigated form by many who do not consider themselves Calvinists. The mitigation consisting in giving a less ascetic interpretation of the alleged will of God, asserting it to be his will that mankind should gratify some of their inclinations, of course not in the manner they themselves prefer, but in the way of obedience, that is, in the way prescribed by prescribed to them by authority. But who were these new Calvinists demanding obedience to their authority? Who are they today? Mill thought they were the majority, and he accordingly decried the tyranny of the majority. But were the majority of peoples in Mill's time, in Mill's high Victorian Britain, really killjoys and scolds? Or was it only the majority of middle-class liberal intellectuals? Reading On Liberty, one does not get the impression that Mill's dreaded neo-Calvinists were the agricultural laborers or the working people of the new factories. Plentiful among Jane Austen's parsons, Calvinists hardly figure among Charles Dickens' ragamuffins and rogues. And today, do the much maligned members of the Samuel Griffith Society, rebel against the oppression of the great unwashed of Parramatta and Liverpool, the Punch Bowl and the Shire? Or is it the killjoys of the inner West and the scolds of Parramatta and the scolds of Paddington, who, to quote Mill, exercise a hostile and dreaded censorship? The masses that the philosophers so love to fear have rarely lifted a finger to censor their self-appointed betters, who, though small in number, are compensatorily loud of voice. The hoi polloi have never exercised the authority to compel obedience to its popular preferences. If they did, we'd all be having a lot more fun. In the 17th century, the Calvinist elect were a self-selected group of highly literate, holier-than-thou Christians, outdoing one another to virtue signal their election to salvation. In the 21st century, the Calvinist elect are a self-selected group of highly literate, holier-than-thou intellectuals, outdoing one another to virtue signal their election to what? It doesn't really matter. In the 17th century, no one knew what heaven was. We still don't today. Sociological Calvinism is all about the election, not about the prize. The election confers authority, the authority to demand self-policing obedience. When people ask Mill's final question, what is usually done by persons of a station and circumstances superior to mine, they look to the intellectual establishment. They look, if not to us, then to people like us. They look to the liberal elite. Mill's tyranny of the majority was, is, and always will be a tyranny of the minority. In our postmodern liberal society, it is inevitably a tyranny of the liberal expert class. It is a tyranny of the doctors, lawyers, the barristers, the business managers and professional directors, the academics and journalists, the senior engineers, the people like you and me. The signals by which we shall recognize the elect are the signals by which we recognize ourselves. Hold a meeting in multicultural Western Sydney without an acknowledgement of country, and no one will notice its absence. Only its presence is noteworthy, transforming the event from the ordinary to the aspirational. Hold a meeting like that of the Samuel Griffith Society without an acknowledgement of country, and it is an act of rebellion. We all notice its omission. Its very absence is a subversive act. Would you trace Australia's cultural heritage to England? That's more rebellion. Hold an all-male panel? Insurrection. Advocate for coal? Treason. The tyranny of the minority is exercised by our colleagues directly over us and only indirectly over society as a whole. Few people in Australian society think very much about such elite esoterica as political correctness, virtue signaling, deplatforming, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're the ones who stand to lose, if not our lives, then at least our livelihoods, and that makes us the first line of defense. In democratic theory, there shouldn't be a problem. One person, one vote means the tyranny of the majority. In democratic practice, we all know that the majority defers to the minority, outer Sydney to inner. The liberal authoritarians of both the Great Awakening and the Great Awokening showed and have shown no hesitation to impose their virtue signaling agendas over the democratic values of the majority. Abolitionists, suffragists, prohibitionists, indigenous rights activists, LGBTQIA+ rights activists, and climate catastrophists alike all have viewed and continue to view their moral agendas as being above mere human law. Accordingly, they have all routinely broken the law, often with impunity. Authoritarianism builds on the established authorities in the societies in which it operates. In the old authoritarianisms of Southern Europe and Latin America, the establishment institutions were the security services and the Catholic Church. Authoritarianism, accordingly, had a distinctively Catholic and militaristic flavor. In today's authoritarian Eastern Europe, the equivalents are the intelligence services and the Orthodox Church. Look no further for the foundations of Alexander Lukashenko's rule in Belarus or Vladimir Putin's in Russia. In the English-speaking world, the most authoritative institutions are the universities, the mainstream media, the peak professional associations, the business councils, and the law courts. Consequently, to the extent that we have an authoritarianism, it is necessarily a liberal authoritarianism, a society governed by the liberal expert class. And the particular strain of liberalism enforced by our liberal authoritarians is a neo-Calvinist theology of racial and sexual liberation, buttressed by a seemingly sincere belief in the apocalyptic end times of climate catastrophism. Right now, this tyrannical minority seems to be having everything its own way, except perhaps elections. Unfortunately, it may not have to win elections, even in a democracy. As Mill recognized, society can and does execute its own mandates, and if it issues wrong mandates instead of right, or any mandates at all in things with which it ought not to meddle, it practices a social tyranny more formidable than many kinds of political oppression. Since, though not usually upheld by such extreme penalties, it leaves fewer means of escape, penetrating much more deeply into the details of life and enslaving the soul itself. Protection, therefore, against the tyranny of the magistrate is not enough. There needs protection against the tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling, against the tendency of society to impose, by other means than civil penalties, its own practices and ideas as rules of conduct on those who dissent. Mill called for, quote, the protection also against the tyranny of prevailing opinion. But what protection? The fact is there is none. No one can protect the individual against society except society itself. The challenge for Australians, the challenge for us, fellow members of the Samuel Griffith Society, is thus not so much to win elections as to change society. The Great Awakening came and went, leaving much wreckage in its wake, but also much good. The Great Awakening will do the same. It is up to us to acknowledge the good while preventing as much of the damage as possible. We all want Indigenous advancement, so let's not let Indigenous women and children be sacrificed on the altar of politically correct policing. We all want LGBTQIA plus rights. Let's not let children's bodies be mutilated to satisfy the career ambitions of megalomaniac doctors. We all want to leave a livable planet to our children. Let's not let irrational regulators impoverish them in this senseless crusade for zero carbon. In a well-institutionalized democracy, the tyranny of the minority won't last forever. It's up to us to hasten its demise and return society to a more humane, more liberal form of liberalism. Thank you.